Meanwhile, let's talk about the World Bank, now projecting a 3.6% point rise in poverty in Nigeria over the next 5 years through 2027. This is according to the bank's Africa's Pulse report released during the ongoing spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank in Washington, D.C. Now, despite recent gains in the non-oil sector in late 2024, reports warn that structural issues like resource dependence and national fragility will likely stall progress. The World Bank says Nigeria, along with other resource-rich and fragile sub-Saharan countries, is expected to see worsening poverty, while the non-resource-rich nations may experience faster poverty reduction. Isn't that ironic? Now, the International Monetary Fund went on to urge the federal government to spend judiciously during this period of heightened spending. Now, there are several issues that they've brought up: persistent high inflation, population growth outspacing economic growth. That is, we're rising in our population, but the economic growth is not tantamount to how much people, so there's a burden on the economy. They also talked about structural economic issues, over dependence on oil, reduction in our output as well. President Muhammadu Buhari in his economic reforms, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu in his economic reforms said that he's looking to see 2.2 million barrels by 2027 and 3 million by 2030. Obviously, if we increase our barrels of oil per day, that in turn increases our revenue. But then they're also saying that there's an over-dependence on oil. We need to invest in other sectors, as well as spread these resources judiciously, ensure that we are spending on what needs to be spent on. Fiscal deficits keep on increasing as well. So the future is really, really bleak based off of this report that they have just put out.
Okay. The IMF this week alone is having spring meetings, IMF and the World Bank. And, you know, in previous conversations, we talked about the completion of the Article 4 consultation on Nigeria by IMF visiting Nigeria. We've talked about the release of the World Economic Outlook, which puts the global average at about 2.8%, which reduces Nigeria to about 3%. We've talked about the global agenda, for poverty, which the IMF boss, Georgieva, was talking about. And in the meeting with the Nigerian delegation at the spring meetings, was talking about certain recommendations for Nigeria and for other African countries. We've talked about the head of the fiscal department of the IMF also making certain recommendations. All of this taken together, you know, within the context of this week's spring meetings, they are saying that African leaders, African countries may not be so directly, heavily impacted by the tariffs and global uncertainties, but there are headwinds, and those headwinds will affect these African economics. In particular, Georgieva singled out Nigeria, Egypt, Ivory Coast, Ghana. And in this regard, she was talking about, commodities. These commodities-dependent economies. In the case of Nigeria, oil is an issue. The spot price of oil is going down. Global demand is dropping. 2, fiscal spending. The head of the fiscal department, in his own suggestion, was saying that, look, these African countries, they have to spend judiciously. That's the phrase that he used. Spend judiciously. More or less the same thing that Georgieva was saying about African leaders addressing the issue of corruption and inefficiency.
That's the word.
If your government is corrupt, if your leaders are leaving it up, they are conspicuously consuming, they are ostentatious, resources will not be available to address the challenge of poverty. She talked about addressing fiscal issues, right? The fiscal space. In other words, you prioritize, you pay attention to what is important. Don't tax the people. You can address issues like tax evasion and all of that, providing infrastructure. African countries should come together and collaborate. These are, some of the points in the recommendations coming out of the various reports. But about poverty figures going up, we should not be surprised. With insecurity, people cannot go to the farm. Of course, poverty figures will go up. With lack of infrastructure, people cannot travel from one part to the other. Only this week, people who can afford to fly from one place to the other. There was disruption, even in aviation travel. You don't have all of that. Then, of course, the poverty level keeps going up. Inflation, they have revised it at the end of March 2025, I think to 24.23%. But we all know that real figure in terms of inflation in this country is higher than that. We'll be very close to about 50%. Even if the statisticians are giving us 24.3, we can believe the evidence of our eyes. We can believe the pandemic of empty pockets that all of us are dealing with every day, and the menace of hunger. Even in that, they are 24.23%. Food inflation is the highest. They say a man that cannot eat, a hungry man, is an angry man. And that is why you have this disruption within the environment. So the challenge, however, the sum of everything that the IMF and World Bank experts are saying is that not just Nigerian leaders, African leaders have to address the challenge of increasing poverty. It's not about throwing statistics at the people. It's about doing what is right. And that's why they are saying spend judiciously, pay attention to fiscal surplus, don't live a corrupt life, provide infrastructure, prioritize the people, invest more in social spending.
Exactly.
If you do all of this, then of course you'll be able to reduce the pandemic of empty pockets. I'm trying to check my pocket.
Pockets are not empty.
No, I'm literally checking my pocket.
These pockets might not have anything, but there are other pockets that we cannot see.
Now, so.
Yeah, but this is a challenge that we face in the real sense of it.
Absolutely, right. Just to add to what Dr. ABATI has said, safety nets as well for the population, especially the population that the 70,000 naira wage population, most especially, increasing these safety nets, because the truth is, within that money as well, these people have to spend on healthcare. A lot of them have to still spend on education, and the food insecurity continues to rise.
That's why I always argue that some of these IMF reforms are duplicitous in nature. Because in one hand, one argument you're saying that free everything into market forces. Everything must be liberalized, and the market should determine the cost of fuel. The markets should determine the cost of electricity. The markets should determine, the value of everything. But we realize now that the markets are not always fair. The market favor those who are already at a privileged and advantaged position, those who have capital already to be able to capitalize, which is why it's called capitalism. Now, I won't get into a whole conversation about the philosophy behind capitalism, but the Bretton Woods institutions have been in existence for almost 80 years now. So we need to start asking ourselves some very important questions. If after 80 years in existence, they're still bringing out these type of reports that say poverty is to rise, if their recommended reforms were so impactful, is this the type of report we should be getting 80 years down the line? I don't think so. Of course, we've known that resource-dependent nations are always going to be more vulnerable to global headwinds. That's why the Global South has been kept in the slavery where we are always pillaged for our raw resources, for our oil, for our minerals, and so forth. But unfortunately, we've gone past the stage where we can blame those who are coming and taking our resources and adding value to them outside and then exporting them back to us at a higher price. We've gone past that stage. It's now our leaders that we have to look at squarely and say, okay, in all these years that we were supposed to be building manufacturing factories, that we were supposed to be beneficating our raw minerals, the Dangote refinery came online. How much support did we really give it in its critical time when it was coming online? We were supposed to be asking ourselves those hard questions. Unfortunately, that's where issues around corruption come to play. That's where issues around what is our vision as a continent in Africa. So many years, I believe it's almost 5 or 6 years since the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement was signed. What are the dividends? Nothing. What have we done with it? Nothing. We just move from meeting to meeting. Say, oh, Africa Free Trade. It's a concept. It's still a concept. within ECOWAS? What's the investment that we're making within ECOWAS? See, if the necessary investments were being made in the regional bloc as ECOWAS, you wouldn't have coups happening left, right, and center, because these coups happen because people are disenfranchised. There's poverty. There's poverty in the land. That's why you find a lot of these ills that we see in our society are flourishing. So for me, I think it's really time for us to interrogate how much these loans we take from the World Bank and the IMF, how much have they benefited us? How much have the reforms benefited us? What other creative ways and models can we implement here in Africa that can protect our people as we build to eventually have those economies that can now open the floodgates and say, let's have liberal free markets?
I love the fact that you talked about some of the local players that we have, especially in our energy sector in Nigeria, and the need for support for the work that they do, because directly or indirectly, this would also contribute to alleviating some of the pressure on the government as it pertains to our inflation as well.